We are currently navigating the treacherous waters of the year 2026, a time when a simple stick of DDR5 RAM costs more than a decent steak dinner for four. The industry tells us that 16 gigabytes is the new minimum, while 32 gigabytes is the sweet spot for any self-respecting enthusiast. But who are they to tell us how to build our home labs, those private sanctuaries of data and self-hosting? I decided to take my own server, a beast equipped with 64 gigabytes of high-speed DDR5, and treat it with a level of cruelty that would make a sysadmin weep. Instead of pulling sticks out of the motherboard like a caveman, I used Linux kernel parameters to trick the system into thinking it was starving. The goal was simple, yet slightly sadistic, as we wanted to find the absolute breaking point. We would start at the bottom, in the dark pits of memory deprivation, and see if our media server, the glorious Jellyfin, could even draw a single breath. We wanted to see when the system would simply give up on life and then slowly, we would grant it more resources until it found its rhythm. This is not just a test of hardware, it is a test of the efficiency of modern software against the greed of hardware manufacturers. We are looking for that perfect equilibrium where performance meets price, without giving an extra cent to the corporate entities that thrive on our insecurities. To set the stage for this experiment, I am using a modern server running Fedora, an operating system known for being on the cutting edge. I have enabled ZRM, which is a clever bit of software wizardry that compresses data in your RAM rather than dumping it onto a slow hard drive. Under normal conditions, with 64 gigabytes at its disposal, the system is as smooth as silk, using barely 3 gigabytes while sitting idle. It sits there, mocking me with its excess, proving that a media server does not actually need a mountain of memory just to exist. This idle state is the calm before the storm, the baseline that shows us just how much waste we usually tolerate in our daily computing lives. The plan was to tighten the noose, starting with a measly 256 megabytes of RAM. In the world of modern computing, 256 megabytes is essentially a death sentence. It is the digital equivalent of trying to run a marathon while breathing through a cocktail straw. I even went as far as to disable the desktop environment, stripping the OS down to its bare, cold bones to save every precious kilobyte. The result was as predictable as it was tragic, because the system simply refused to boot. It reached a certain point in the startup process, looked at its empty pockets, and decided it was better to stay dead than to live in such poverty. This failure tells us something important about the state of software in 2026. We have moved so far past the era of lean coding that 256 megabytes is no longer a functional amount of memory for a modern Linux kernel. The tech companies have won this round, ensuring that their software is so bloated that yesterday's high-end specs are today's paperweights. If you are trying to build a server out of parts you found in a dumpster from 2008, you are going to have a very bad time. We have officially crossed the threshold where the bare minimum is much higher than we would like to admit. Moving up to 512 megabytes, we finally saw a flickering pulse of life, but it was a life not worth living. The system did manage to boot, but it was like watching a 90-year-old man try to climb a mountain in a blizzard. Every command I typed felt like it was traveling through a vat of molasses before reaching the processor. The system was desperately swapping data to the disk, a process known as thrashing, where the hard drive tries to act like RAM but fails miserably. Even trying to log in became a test of patience, as the session would often time out before the system could even ask for my password. The bottleneck here was not the CPU or the network. It was the sheer lack of a working area for the operating system to think. When you starve a server of RAM, it spends all its energy moving tiny pieces of data back and forth from the storage, leaving no room for actual work. It is a frantic, useless cycle that generates heat and frustration but very little output. At 512 megabytes, the server is technically alive, but it is unusable for anything other than perhaps a very slow clock. This is the graveyard of efficiency where the dream of low-cost computing goes to die. When we reached the 1 gigabyte mark, we finally saw the first real signs of a functional media server. Jellyfin actually managed to start up, and I could even see the library interface through my web browser. However, the moment I clicked play on a video, the system went into a state of absolute panic. The RAM filled up instantly, and the swap usage spiked as if the server were gasping for air. Seeking through a video was an exercise in futility, with the screen freezing for 10 seconds every time I tried to skip a boring scene. 1 gigabyte is what I would call the threshold of frustration. It is just enough memory to make you think it might work, only to snatch that hope away the moment you actually try to use it. It is like owning a car that only runs when you are pushing it downhill. While you might be able to brag that you got a server running on 1 gigabyte, you will spend more time troubleshooting it than actually watching your favorite shows. This is the level where the tech companies laugh at us, knowing we will eventually break down and buy that expensive upgrade just to make the pain stop. The 2 gigabyte mark is where things finally started to feel like a real computer again. The interface became responsive, and the system no longer felt like it was drowning in its own swap space. I could seek through a video with relatively low latency, and for a single user, it was almost a pleasant experience. However, the moment the server had to perform a task like transcoding, which is converting video on the fly, the cracks began to show. The CPU usage would skyrocket, and the system would start leaning on the swap space again like a crutch. At 2 gigabytes, you are living on the edge of a cliff. It works for one person, doing one thing, at one specific time. But the moment you add a second user or try to run a background task, the whole house of cards starts to wobble. This is the absolute minimum I would recommend for anyone who values their sanity, but it is far from an ideal setup. It is a survivalist's server, built for a world where every megabyte is a luxury we can barely afford. It shows us that while we can get by with very little, we sacrifice the soul of the user experience in the process. Stepping up to 4 gigabytes, we enter the territory of the legitimate budget home server. This is the sweet spot for people who use old office PCs or cheap single-board computers. At this level, Jellyfin runs with a sense of confidence that was missing at the lower tiers. You can even run a basic NAS operating system alongside it without the whole thing collapsing into a heap of error messages. The system still uses a bit of swap here and there, but it is no longer the frantic, life-saving measure it was before. It is more of a safety net. 4 gigabytes is the good enough tier for the average person who just wants to stream their movies without a headache. It is cheap, it is plentiful, and it is compatible with almost any hardware you can find from the last decade. The tech companies hate this tier because it represents the point where their planned obsolescence starts to fail. You don't need their latest and greatest hardware if 4 gigabytes of old DDR4 can handle your entire movie collection. It is a rebellion in the form of a modest memory stick, proving that you don't need to be a millionaire to have a high-quality media experience. But then we hit 8 gigabytes and suddenly, the clouds parted and the sun began to shine on our digital landscape. This is the point where the server stopped feeling like a machine and started feeling like an extension of my own will. Everything was instantaneous. The metadata loaded before I could even blink, and the video playback was as smooth as a high-end streaming service. There was no swap usage to speak of, meaning the system had enough room to keep all its important files right there in the fast lane of the RAM. I want to be very clear about this. 8 gigabytes is the gold standard for a home media server in 2026. It provides enough breathing room for the operating system, the media server, and a few other small containers without ever feeling cramped. You are no longer fighting the hardware, you are using it. There is no lag, no stuttering, and no compromise. This is the level where you stop being a victim of the hardware market and start becoming the master of your own domain. If you are building a server today, this is your target, your sanctuary of stability. Moving to 16 gigabytes is where we start to talk about real power and the freedom to expand. At this level, you aren't just running a media server, you are running a miniature data center. You can have multiple people streaming different movies at the same time, while your server downloads new content and organizes your photos in the background. The RAM usage is so comfortable that the system barely even notices when you add a new workload. It is the feeling of driving a powerful car on an empty highway, knowing you have plenty of horsepower left if you need to pass someone. 16 gigabytes allows for the kind of multitasking that turns a simple hobby into a true home lab. You can experiment with virtual machines, run dozens of Docker containers, or even host your own private cloud. This is the level that the tech companies try to upsell us on, and for once, the upgrade is actually worth the investment if you plan on doing more than just watching movies. It is the bridge between a consumer-grade toy and a professional-grade tool. If you have the budget, this is where the fun really begins, as the limits of your hardware are no longer defined by your memory. Finally, we look at the 32 gigabyte tier, which is where we leave the realm of necessity and enter the world of pure, unadulterated luxury. For a media server, 32 gigabytes is like having a private jet just to go to the grocery store. Most of that memory will sit idle. doing absolutely nothing but looking pretty in your system monitor. However, for the advanced user, the developer, or the person who wants to run a complex laboratory of interconnected services, this is the ultimate playground. It allows you to compile software, run heavy databases, and simulate entire networks without ever breaking a sweat. 32 gigabytes is for the person who never wants to think about RAM again. It is a statement of dominance over the software bloat of the modern world. While the lords of silicon try to force us into a cycle of constant upgrades, 32 gigabytes says, not today. It is future-proofing in its purest form, ensuring that your server will remain relevant and powerful for years to come. But let's be honest, for a simple Jellyfin box, it is complete overkill. It is the digital equivalent of wearing a tuxedo to a backyard barbecue. You look great, but it's probably a bit much for the occasion. So, what have we learned from this descent into memory madness? The journey from 256 megabytes to 32 gigabytes has shown us that the minimum requirements printed on the box are often just suggestions. You can survive on 2 gigabytes, you can thrive on 8 gigabytes, and you can rule the world on 16. The tech companies want you to believe that you always need more, that your current hardware is a ticking time bomb of obsolescence. They want you to fear the red line in your task manager, but now you know the truth. The real villain in this story isn't the software that demands more memory, it is the industry that prices that memory as if it were a rare earth mineral. They create the bloat, then sell you the cure. My advice to you is simple: don't play their game. If you're building a dedicated media server, stop at 8 gigabytes and spend the rest of your money on more storage or better movies. If you want a full-featured home lab, 16 is your sweet spot. Don't let the marketing departments of the world convince you that you need a NASA-grade supercomputer just to watch a sitcom in bed. As we wrap up this experiment, I want you to look at your own system. Are you overpaying for resources you aren't using? Or are you struggling on a system that is gasping for air? Take a moment to check your RAM usage the next time you're streaming, and you might be surprised at how much waste is actually there. If you found this deep dive into the guts of home networking useful, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We are here to help you navigate the complex world of technology without losing your shirt in the process.